So I decided to put together a quick comparison between the primary arms SLX Nova and the SIG Tango-MSR with the Hellfire reticle. I believe that these two are very comparable, and I had a little bit of footage left over from the two individual reviews that I thought would be interesting to look at here in a little bit more detail. So where we're at in this first scene is at one of the local locking dams on the Mississippi River, where this boat that we're zooming in on right now is at about 200 yards from the position where I was filming from. And just a couple things that I'd like to point out. We can see obviously that it's a very sunny day, and if we look at the SIG Tango-MSR side of the image here, in the high contrast areas you can see just a little bit more purple fringing and chromatic aberration on some of those white antennas on top of the boat, whereas on the SLX side we see actually very little. The other thing to notice, just as we're panning here, is the overall apparent size of the image. These are cropped exactly the same, and we can see that the SLX just takes up a little bit more of the visual field of view. But that also means that we have a slightly larger absolute field of view through the scope as we get settled here on this next position. I'm going to point out a couple of things. If I can get that SLX to sit still. There we go. If you look at the left edge of the field of view on both, the difference isn't very much, but it is a little bit wider on that side, where you can see that life preserver is just barely in view on the MSR. We can see that the field of view, even though it's cut off in the crop, extends a little bit further past on that boat to the left. And you also see down there at the bottom where that set of steps are, how the MSR cuts off that bottom step and the Nova does not. So now we're going to zoom back out so we can pan over to another location. But I'm going to be quiet for just a minute and let you guys kind of observe how the image transits. Oop, I'm sorry, I did a hard cut on that one. What I do wish is I could have got those birds for both shots, but they weren't there in the first one. They were actually filmed a couple of hours apart. If you look at the sun on that vertical pillar, the MSR, you can see much more of that pillar illuminated on the face towards us, whereas on the SLX it's still in the shadows. That's just because the sun had moved when I did the SLX after the MSR. So we're going to zoom in on this. I think that's the control house for the dam, and I got to do a couple of adjustments for the shot quality or image quality on the SLX. But that building that we're looking at now, if I remember correctly, is right about 600 yards from where we were standing, or from where I was standing when I was shooting this. And again, we see the same thing on those hard edges where there's high contrast. We see more of the chromatic aberration in the MSR than we do in the SLX. What else do I want to say? What else do we need to see looking at it here? We can talk about the brightness. Both of the reticles were on about an 8 for this bright daylight. Higher than that, they started to bloom kind of aggressively, and you can see it in the lens or in the shot, which I don't really like to do. And then the other thing to point out is the reticle itself, as far as like the stadia line, just the amount of obstruction we get from the MSR, whereas the fine lines on the SLX still do a good job of drawing your attention to the center of the field of view, but aren't really covering much of your image at all. And again, I'm going to have to adjust this brightness just because the light was less cooperative when the sun got higher in the sky for the SLX. But as far as overall sharpness, these fine lines of these cables really do a good job of highlighting that both of these scopes have a good image. Like, we can see all of those cables extending down from the booms, and we can see a lot of the actual framework of those two cranes, as well as just some of the finer detail in the what are those? The hooks, that actually did the lifting. with the little black and yellow hazard markers on the side of those. We can make both those colors out in both of these. So the color representation of these is pretty good. I'd say that the major difference that we can see here is just chromatic aberration, and the overall field of view is going to be the big difference in these two. But I'm going to go ahead and switch the shooting location here. We're going to go to a different spot. We're going to look at some actual targets at some different distances. The first target we're going to look at here in the floodplain is going to be at 300 yards, and it is a standard 18-inch wide paper torso type target that you would use at any pistol range. You can see that when I get both of these first BDC hash marks settled on it, they accurately measure that at 300 yards with their width. And as I move this image around on both these a little bit, I want to take a moment to point out again the overall field of view that the SLX has over the Nova, and just the general clarity that we're seeing there, where the SLX maybe has just a hair more definition in those trees and stuff there in the distance than the MSR is showing. But both of them on this day where I was filming this are doing a good job with their light gathering ability, even though the day was pretty heavily overcast. Even in these conditions, they're both able to pick up quite a bit of detail with the reduced amount of light compared to what we saw on the dam next to the Mississippi River. Here in a moment, I'm going to get these two settled down on this 8-inch gong that I have in front of the passenger door. And it's going to give us an idea of how much of the reticle, or how much of the target the reticle is going to obstruct at that distance, which in the case of both of these scopes is pretty minimal. The BDC lines and the crosshair itself remain pretty thin and don't obstruct a bunch of our target. The same cannot be said about the extended stadia lines on the MSR, both the 3, 6, and 9. When you get out away from the center crosshair, those get pretty thick, obviously, and they do begin to obstruct a fair amount of our field of view there around our target. Particularly if you pay attention as it gets up here on some of these cars that are a little further away. I think that gray SUV was right at about 410 yards, and then they just continue on, further back into the parking lot. And we can see that, as we move that reticle around, it's starting to cover up a fair amount of those cars where you wouldn't be able to see, people moving around back there if you needed to. Whereas on the SLX, even that biker back there who's probably in about that same 400-yard range, it's not obstructing any of that. But I don't think I need to talk about anything else at this distance. The last bit of footage that I want to include here is the same targets, except now we are at 500 yards. And I'm going to do the same as before and line up the appropriate BDC hash mark on the target, which in this case is the 3rd hash mark on both of these reticles. Here we can see that it is again ranging quite nicely against that silhouette target. The other thing that starts to be more apparent with this image is that the clarity and sharpness of the SLX at these longer distances is starting to set itself apart from the MSR, which is just not as sharp of an image. It's not that it's a bad image, it's not that it's not usable, it's just that the SLX is a little bit better. And I'm going to go ahead and move both of these over again to put the 3rd hash mark on the 8-inch gong sitting there just above that rock. And we're going to see that in both cases the reticle is now starting to obstruct a fair amount of that target, where if you didn't have really good lighting conditions, even that bright red target is going to be a little bit difficult to spot behind the reticle. And in reality, if you were shooting at this distance and there was really anything more than maybe a 5-mile-an-hour wind, you're going to be off the edge of that target to a varying degree, just depending on your conditions. So while the hash mark is obstructing the plate if you were directly on it, the likelihood that you will be directly on it is pretty small. But because we only have a hash mark to work with, we see the other limitation of both of these reticles, and that is the lack of useful wind marks or BDC spots like you would see in a normal, ballistic reticle, something like you would see in the Venom, that's going to give you specific wind holds for 5, 10, 15 miles an hour. Neither one of these do it. So at that point, you would be making references off of things in the background around the target, which is never as reliable as having your reticle do the work for you. But I don't know that there's much else that we need to talk about in this one. These reticles are very similar in their general configuration. It's just matters of degree about which one you might prefer. Some people might like the heavier lines of the MSR if they're planning on using it at close distances, and people who want to have the finer lines out there at the longer distances are probably going to like the Nova reticle on the primary arms. And I think I'm going to wrap this video up, and thank you for taking the time to watch it, and I look forward to reading your comments if you have something you would like to add that I may not have thought of.